Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H virtual event space. You are tuned into the Beauty of Travel series, and today we are on part 2 of 3 with photographer Jim Nix. Today we're going to be talking about landscapes. If you guys weren't around yesterday, Jim went into some cityscapes, and we'll drop that link in the chat there for those of you guys who weren't able to watch it. Jim, welcome back. How's it going?
Sorry, I should have been more prepared. It's going good. I was trying to reach 2 of my Sony lenses I'm going to be talking about today. But yeah, happy to be back. Thanks for having me. Thanks to B&H team, the Sony team, and of course, thanks to everybody out there who may be watching and following along. We're going to talk about landscapes today, and similar format to yesterday. If you saw that, if not, it is on the B&H Event Space YouTube channel. But we talked about cityscapes and today's landscapes, and we're going to just go through some tips, tricks. I'll show you some images. I'll edit a couple images, and we'll do Q&A and all that fun stuff. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, pleasure to always have you, Jim. I'm going to turn it over to you, let you do what you do best. Okay. I'll do what I do best and get the heck out of here, but I'll see you guys in a bit for some Q&A.
Okay, awesome. And here we go. You should be able to see my screen. So that's me out shooting a landscape in Utah, and I need to move a couple of things just to make sure that I can see my screen. Anyway, yeah, we're talking about landscape photography today, and thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. I hope everybody's having a wonderful day. You can find me online at all the usual places, just like everybody else. So my website is just my name. It's a very short name, very easy to use. So just jimnix.com. I do also have a newsletter. And one of the editing things I'll be doing here today, of course, is in Luminar Neo. I'm an ambassador for them and make a lot of tutorial videos on my YouTube channel, which is linked there. But on my website, I have a newsletter. I offer free presets and a couple of ebooks and things like that, mostly around Luminar Neo. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check that out. And of course, I have a Facebook page under Jim Nix Photo. And on Instagram, I'm just Jim Nix. So we're going to be talking about Sony cameras and gear and landscapes and tips and tricks and all that kind of fun stuff. I've been using Sony since I got my first Sony camera, which is this one here, the A7 Mark II in 2016. So 7 years ago that I first got Sony, and I have not looked back. I've loved every minute of it. I think the raw files look fantastic. I love the full frame mirrorless. I love the lenses. They're incredibly sharp and accurate and all these kind of things. I'm shooting now with the A7R3, and I've got a couple of zoom lenses, the 16-35 and the 24-70, both the newest version, the GM2, which the wide angle, the 16-35, which is right here. And I know there's a B&H link that could probably be shared if you guys want to check that out. But that is a fantastic lens, and I've been using it for a few weeks. I got it like the day it came out, which was about a month ago. I've been in Colorado, already been using it, and I'm going to be in East Texas in the swamps this weekend taking photos with it as well. So I'm excited about that. 24-70 is great, and I use that for landscapes. But the other one that I really, and I'm going to say really a third time, really love for landscapes is the 14, also a GM lens. It's an f1.8, gives you that nice, lovely wide view of things, and that 14 mil is just fantastic. And so that is possibly my favorite landscape lens, and you can see that in the prime lens listing here. I've got 3 other prime lenses. Sometimes use the 20 mil for landscapes. The other 2 I don't really. Generally speaking, the 20, the 24, and the 35 I generally reserve for kind of walk around cityscape / street photography. We'll be talking about that next week if you tune into the 3rd episode. As far as photography goes, and my philosophy, I'm a huge believer in this quote from Ansel Adams, that you don't take a photograph, you make it. And I think many times with landscape photography, that's perhaps even more true than it is in other types of photography, simply because if you're trying to get the right setting sun in the right location and all those kind of things, there's a lot of planning that goes into making the photograph. You don't just well, usually you don't just show up in the place at the right time and get the perfect light. That does happen occasionally, and of course we're always super happy when that happens. But generally speaking, you're planning ahead, trying to figure out where to be and when, where the sun's going to be, and all those kind of things. So it's a very active pursuit, just getting there and setting up for the photo. Then, of course, you're very active in terms of your settings in your camera, taking the photo, the exposure time, whatever it is you're trying to do. And then I'm also a big believer in editing photos, which is what I'll also be demoing today in this webinar. And that's another part of making a photo. So those are the things that I think are really true about photography. Now, I'll cover some of these things and we'll go through some example photos and then we'll do some edits, as I said. But as far as top tips, definitely planning ahead. PhotoPills is a great app for that. There's time of day considerations. Generally speaking, most landscape photographers are aiming for sunset, and simply because, if the light breaks through the clouds, and if you have clouds, you can get just a beautiful kind of setup, I guess, for lack of a better term. I'm also a fan of sticking around after sunset is finished and into blue hour. I love that, to be honest. I'm also a big fan of sunrise. I'm more of a sunrise person when it comes to shooting in cities. I talked about that on the cityscape webinar yesterday, but also in landscapes, there are places where, the sun is rising, behind a mountain or something like that, and sunrise is the only place where that makes sense. An example of that is Diamond Beach in Iceland, where it's pretty much a sunrise location just because of where it's located and the way it sort of faces. And then, of course, there's night sky. And it's another thing I like about this 14 mil 1.8 in Iceland about a year ago. I was able to get out early one morning, about 6 a.m., and I caught the aurora just behind our hotel and was able to shoot it with that 14. And so that wide 1.8 aperture, slightly elevated ISO, and a really wide scene with the mountains behind me, I was able to capture the aurora. So things to think about. Also slowing down. I find I'm a person that, as you probably are as well, you love to get somewhere, you see a place, you're like, oh my God, this is gorgeous, and you start taking photos. I'm incredibly guilty of that pretty much every time I go out. So this third one about slowing down and thinking is much and probably more so a message for myself than it is for you all. But it's something that's important because, I will get the camera out and be like, oh my gosh, this is gorgeous, and start taking photos. And maybe I didn't look at, my ISO was at 4,000 or 5,000 because I was shooting the night sky last night and forgot to change it, or some setting was off, and just because I'm in a hurry, I'm excited. So I try to tell myself to slow down and think, and that leads to better photos, leads to better compositions, things like that. As far as gear goes, obviously I'm talking about Sony cameras and lenses, simply because I've used them for 6-7 years now, I guess 7 years, and absolutely love them. Tripods, filters, all that comes into play with landscapes, and I'm a big fan of using my tripod nearly every time I'm out shooting landscape photos. For street photography, I don't carry a tripod. Cityscapes, it's hit or miss. It just depends on what it is I'm going out to shoot. But generally speaking, tripods and filters are in the bag for landscapes. Changing perspective is something I've been thinking about more and more in the last year or so. And that is that, you look at a landscape and you got your camera set up and you're taking the photo in that horizontal orientation. And I'm finding more and more that I'm turning my camera into the vertical or portrait orientation and taking photos there and really liking the results. And it's not something I really did a whole lot in the past. And of course, I blame Instagram stories for that and my iPhone. But it's a good sort of different way to look at things. And I think that's good. And that really leads into that last point, which is experimentation. I find that I grow and learn and change and adapt and do, cool new things when I'm experimenting and playing around. And I think that's important. And that's both in the field, capturing the photo, but also in post in terms of editing the photo. Now, when I'm out, light obviously is the most important thing that we're always looking for or thinking about and considering when we're shooting. Color is a big one for me. I'm just a huge fan of kind of bold, saturated colors. I just like it. Foregrounds is a great way to anchor composition, and I'll show you a good example of that. But the use of something in the foreground, I feel like it anchors the photo and it helps lead the eye from from the foreground really all the way through the photo in a landscape. And I find that to be really important. I love the sense of motion, which in a landscape, like I don't want the trees blowing, but if there's running water, that could be a waterfall or a river, I'm all about that. Absolutely just adore shooting waterfalls. I just love longer exposures. And like in the cityscape webinar yesterday, for me, a longer exposure there is catching light trails of passing cars and buses. you don't have that when you're out shooting landscapes, but the sense of motion I do like is that of moving water. And I like just dragging the shutter. It doesn't have to be long. I mean, I've done plenty of 10 stop, 1 or 2 minute long kind of exposures where the water is just super, super smooth. But I also like having a little bit of texture, like in a waterfall, where you're just doing a quarter of a second or a half a second, and you can still make out the detail and the structure in the water without over smoothing it by doing too long of an exposure. So even if it's just a quarter, a third, half a second, I just think that looks great. Scale is important, and I'll show you an example of that. Reflections I love. That goes back to water. And as with really any photo, I'm looking for lines and kind of like, where is my eye led in the composition? I like patterns and abstracts as well, and I'll show you an example of that. And then even the intimate scenes, and I don't think I have any photos here today like that, but intimate scenes could be like you're walking and you're looking at this landscape, and I shot one of these recently in Colorado, and I look down and there's a couple of red leaves on the ground surrounded by like yellow leaves. And I'm like, that's perfect. So I got a photo of it. So just, looking around, and that's going back to changing the perspective. It just kind of gets you thinking differently. So Iceland, I got the chat window here. I see there might be something in chat. Okay. Nope. Okay. Iceland is amazing. I've been there with the Skylum team 3 times now and can't wait to go back. It's an incredibly gorgeous country. And this was a situation where we planned to go here for sunset anyway. So it wasn't that we saw that the light was going to be right. We just knew that we wanted to be here at this beautiful waterfall called Seljelensfoss, and I'm sure I mispronounced that, but it's in South Iceland, not far from the coast. But we got there, and it was a gorgeous golden hour and a gorgeous sunset, as you can see. I used the wide angle lens here, and this is one of those 1-second exposures where you just get some of the motion in the water, but you don't have just a white sheet that's completely blurred out. So just fantastic there. And I love that 14 mil wide angle because you're essentially in a cave. You kind of carved out behind the waterfall, and that wide angle and that 14 mil just helps me capture it all. This is both a sense of motion, but also kind of I'm going to call it an intimate scene. It's not super intimate in that regard, but it's just a chunk of ice that's sitting on the beach at sunrise. So time of day consideration, this is Diamond Beach in Iceland. And this was using the previous generation of the 16 to 35 wide angle. And you can see it's just 1 second. So you get that beautiful flow on these waves and these that are just receding. And so what you do is you wait for the waves to come all the way to the top. And then as soon as they start receding, you start taking photos a second at a time or a half second, whatever you're setting for. But I was doing a second at a time. And you just get that nice receding water kind of peeling back away. And I just love that sense of motion. It gives a sense of energy to a landscape that, otherwise landscapes, they don't really possess a lot of energy. That's what I like about the motion. Like in that previous, you get the sense of energy from the falling water, and you can just feel like the thunderous roar. And here you can feel the sense of energy from the motion of the water. So now here's one from Iceland as well. And in fact, the majority of the photos here, I think, are probably from Iceland. Another one with the 14 wide angle. We showed up, and it was just an incredible golden hour and an amazing sunset. And we stayed here for quite a while. The beach is over to the right, and it's a very popular place to shoot. But there was all this water, and this was a thin. You can see it's a thin, maybe a 1/4 inch tops of water. And I was just walking around looking for different things that I can do because I love reflections, and I took about 1,000 photos here of these reflections. But I was like, it's cool to have a mirrored reflection photo, and I'll show you one that I really like. But also, I wanted something in the foreground. While I kept walking around, I found this rock, and I was able to line it up to where that rock in the foreground, I feel like it draws your eye, and kind of the way the rock is shaped. And no, I didn't place it there, and I didn't move it. It was just like that. The tip of this rock is kind of pointing up into the rest of the photo, into what's called Vestrahorn, which is that mountain there. So it just kind of worked out. But again, this is another one with a wide angle of 14, just being able to get, a whole lot. And that's a really big mountain, but you're able to get the whole thing in with that 14 mil. And here's that same place slightly later after golden hour is over, and we were deep into sunset and heading towards blue hour. And this was obviously without a foreground element, where I just went for the mirrored reflection. And I like that quite a bit as well. Here, I kind of purposefully did a little bit more smoothing versus here, I added a little bit more kind of structure to the mountain, as well as to the reflection and some of the foreground where the sand and that rock is. On this one, I did in post a little bit more smoothing to make it feel a little bit calmer and a little bit more serene, I guess. The other thing to think about is the difference between these two. And I talked about this some yesterday, and I'll probably talk about it today, is I think a lot about light and color and that sort of stuff when I'm editing. And so here, the yellow warmth one feels a little bit more energetic, a little bit more intense. And so that extra structure, like in the mountains and the reflection and the sand, kind of, to me, lends itself to that. Whereas this one, it's a little calmer, it's a little more serene, it's more blue. Blue is a calmer color. And so that just kind of fits into me with that overall theme. So same place, same day, probably an hour or so apart in terms of my shooting. Now, in terms of patterns and abstracts, this one is not entirely abstract because you can see the horizon on the distance. Although while there, I also took some photos, zoomed in a little tighter on different kind of portions of these hills, if you want to call them that. But this is the Badlands of South Dakota. It's a pretty cool place. I shot this with a lens I don't have anymore. The lenses I listed earlier is my current Sony lens lineup. I had the 24 to 240. I just found that I wasn't really shooting very much beyond 70 mil, which is why I don't have a lens longer than that anymore. And you can see here, I was at 52. So I didn't really need the 240. But the point is, I wanted to go for a little bit of an abstract here. I wanted to play up some of the detail and the structure in these hills. And this was kind of a sunset-y kind of feel, but just really intense kind of detail in this barren earth in the Badlands of South Dakota. Now, the opposite of that, of course, is here in Anguilla, which is down in the Caribbean. Just a beautiful, soft, kind of serene sunset. I shot this with the first 24 to 70 that I had from Sony, which was the original f4. So I shot this on my first Sony camera. I shot this a few years ago before I had my current setup, but this was actually a handheld photo. And I just kind of wanted to line up where you got a little bit of this curve of this wet sand. And of course, the water, which is causing the curve in the wet sand, kind of mirrors that shape. And it kind of also mirrors the shape in the direction of the clouds. And then I placed the sun over there kind of on the rule of thirds axis, not entirely, but kind of. Anyway, and just played up a little bit of the color and the shapes in sunset. But I love to shoot at sunset like everybody. I mean, there's nobody that says, oh, I don't like sunset. You know, we all love it. And of course, it's for these reasons. It's great to have a nice sunset with beautiful light, but when you get light with clouds like this, where you can see that sun is dropping, but it's hitting the underside of these clouds here, it's just fun. I mean, we all know that. So coming into a situation where you don't have a lot of light because you're in a forest. This was up in Oregon, and this was with the 20 mil 1.8, which is quite possibly my favorite lens. I've just had it for several years, and I've used it so much. I just love it. And as you can probably tell, I'm a bit of a fan of the wider view anyway, which is, again, why I don't have anything that goes past 70 mil. But just walking in Oregon, and I like lines, as I mentioned, and so I'm looking for something that will lead the viewer's eye through the photo. And I think this does a good job of that. And then the edit, and I'll show you this, I may edit this one here live today. I kind of played up that light source at the end of the photo to kind of look like you're aiming towards something. It didn't really look like that, of course. Scale, I talked about scale, and it's popular these days to add a human into landscapes to give a sense of scale. And it also, I think, ties the viewer to the photo because they can kind of imagine themselves. When you see another human in an otherwise empty landscape, you get a sense of the size of it, but it also, I think, kind of emotionally or at least visually ties the viewer to the scene. And they say, oh, I can imagine standing there or whatever. This was in Iceland, of course, in an ice cave. Just imagine if that human wasn't there. You'd have no idea if that was, 6-inch tall gap and I was really close, or if that was a 6-foot tall gap or a 60-foot tall gap. You just can't really tell. This is an HDR, 3 exposures. I blended slightly elevated ISO. And again, the 14 wide angle, because I just like to capture all that. But that HDR allowed me to get detail and light in the dark parts of the cave that I'm standing inside of, and also get an exposure that was exposed for this sky outside, because the difference in the light between the two is significant. And so blending those three, it was a 3 exposure HDR, blending those 3 together, I get a nice base image. Then I can go edit a little bit further to kind of play up the things I want to play up. But that's something about adding some scale to the image. And so I think that person there works well. Also, there were people all lined up, but I wanted to get way to the right, because where he was standing, I didn't want to be to the left and put him in the middle of that hole or cutout. And I didn't want to be too far to the left where he was close to the left edge of it or anything. What I wanted to do is, because he's looking to that left direction, I wanted to make sure that there was plenty of space that looks like he would be looking out over something vast. And in other words, I didn't want him close to the edge that he was looking towards. I just think it visually makes sense. So I was literally leaning up against the wall, and it was cold, but super worth it to take the photos. Speaking of scale, this one is Pulpit Rock in Norway. And that person is crazy for standing there. I could not do it. I got to about 3 feet of the edge, and I was honestly shaking. My legs were quivering. I had my camera on my tripod, and I had to take a couple of quick shots and scoot back because I was way, way too scared. But some people are brave, including that person. But the sense of scale here, you can see that is a pretty significant drop, because you can see that tiny boat. So when I saw that going by, I thought, ooh, that'd be great. And then I shot it with the 16-35. This is a few years ago, so this is the original f4 version. But I shot it with the wide angle to get as much of the scene in as possible, because it allows, it illustrates a sense of scale, I think. This one I just shot a few weeks ago up in Colorado. This is about changing perspective. And I'm sure you've seen a million photos like this. It's a popular thing to do, but the sun was out. It's beautiful afternoon in terms of just being super blue. And these yellowy gold aspens were just, I don't know, they were just perfect. And I love the color contrast, because yellow and blue are complementary colors, kind of playing that off of each other here. I just love how that one came out. This was essentially 3 minutes and change, 3:20, I guess, exposure at Moraine Lake up in the Banff National Park, Canada. And 10-stop filter there at sunset. Just wanted to get a sense of motion, because the lake is pretty glassy and very blue. The sky and the clouds are kind of moving slowly, but I put that filter on. I dragged the shutter for 3 minutes and change, and you end up with these, what I consider beautiful photos. I'm also just a fan of long exposures. So things like that are a good way to kind of use that sense of motion to illustrate kind of energy in what would otherwise be a very still landscape. And I've got plenty of photos from that same day that I didn't do a long exposure, and to me, they just don't have the same impact. Speaking of impact, this was a sunrise in Colorado a few weeks ago. I was up for sunrise my first day there, and I ran across the street from where I was staying, and there was this pond. I'd been there before because I'd stayed here before a few years ago, and so I knew there was a pond over there. Then I saw this little boat, and I thought that was a great little foreground element to kind of anchor the composition. And then I used HDR again, simply because the sun wasn't yet up, and it was pretty dark in a lot of areas. And so using that exposure blending technique just allowed me to capture a scene like this. Also, I like how the boat is kind of pointing toward the sunrise right through those 2 trees where the sun seems to be coming up right there. So, and that was shot with the new 16-35 wide angle. And then one more. This was just a quicker snap of a stunningly gorgeous sunset in Colorado a few weeks ago, also with the wide angle 16-35. And I'm a huge fan of taking a lot of photos, whether it's landscape, cityscape, street photography. I don't want to measure the success of an outing based on the quantity of photos I take, because I want to take quality photos. But I also do believe you got to get your reps in, and that's an important thing. So I generally take a lot of photos when I'm out somewhere. I think in the 6 days or so I was in Colorado, I took like 2,700 photos or something like that. So having said all that, let's pop into Luminar. And first, I'm going to take a quick sip of my tea, and then we'll do some editing. Okay, the first thing I want to do is I'm actually going to go into this. This is one of those kind of intimate scenes, and it basically is just a tiny subsection of a river in Washington. We were staying at a little cabin in the woods, and there was a little river behind it. So I got my tripod and I went out there to play around, and this is what I came up with. It was a beautiful scene, But to me, this was the most compelling thing I could do, which was just focus on the motion of the water. And so one of the things I like to do is just come in. I always start with develop raw. I always shoot raw files. Gives you a lot more latitude in post, and I'm a big fan of doing things in post. But for a photo like this, it doesn't really require a lot of editing. I mean, you can just come in and adjust a little bit of contrast. You can see the histogram up here. You can also hit the J key, which will show you with an overlay as to whether or not anything's blown out or completely dark. Nothing's like that, so I'm pretty safe there. I could actually lift the highlights and the whites a little bit. And in this case, I would actually take the shadows down and maybe the blacks down a little bit. And, I've just got to, I do see the spots. And by the way, you can take those out automatically in Luminar. I'm just not going to do it so as not to spend our time on it. But I'm aware of those, and it is easy to take them out in Luminar. But what I want to show you here is just sometimes, you go and you plan for the really big, broad, expansive kind of view. And instead, you end up with the kind of tiny, intimate, smaller view like this one. But really quick and easy, you can have a pretty impactful photo. And exposure-wise, this was 4/10 of a second. So 4/10 of a second was enough to blur it out, but not blur it out completely. So I still get a sense of that motion, because if I were to go for, 30 seconds, it would just be a big white sheet, basically, which to me doesn't have anywhere near the same impact. So I'm a big fan of doing that with water. And I used to do the really long exposures, and I've gotten over the last few years to where I just do the quarter second, half second, that kind of thing, just to give me a little bit of a sense of motion. Now, this is this is called Jökulsárlón. My Icelandic is terrible, but I'm going to go ahead and fix this distortion, and that vignetting, you'll see that go away here in a second. But it's an ice lagoon where there's a glacier off to the right-hand side, and that glacier has chunks of ice that fall off and they float through this lagoon. And it's kind of amazing, to be honest. Once again, I'm in Develop Raw. I'm going to brighten the exposure a little bit, put on the highlights, maybe add a little bit of contrast. I'm going to go into color, and here it was a beautiful sunset. I want to bring up some of those colors and tones. And I'm going to add a little bit of vibrance as well. So maybe something like that, maybe not that much, but just a little bit to get me going. And the tool that I like to use second is called Super Contrast. As you can see here, it divides contrast into 3 different zones based on the tones. So midtones, highlights, midtones, and shadows. And usually what I do, people ask me a lot about Super Contrast, because I make a lot of YouTube videos with Luminar. People ask me about it, and there's no science to this tool for me. I always go in and I go about a quarter or a third of the way, and then I just grab these balance sliders and I move them left and right, and I see which one I like better. That's it. I mean, I would love to say that it's science, but it's completely art in the sense that I'm kind of making it up as I go with this tool. But what it does is it gives me beautiful control over the different tonal areas, and so I'm able to slightly change the contrast by just moving a couple of sliders. I'm just a fan of that. And there's a great color tool in Luminar called Color Harmony that actually is made up of 4 different tools, and we're going to use a couple of them here. Brilliance and warmth is, as the name implies, drag it to the right, creates a bit more brilliant, saturated photo. I do recommend, if you're using a couple of color tools, just to be careful and not go too far, because these do, they're incremental, right? There's more on top of more on top of more, and pretty soon you end up with a really colorful, potentially unrealistic color setup in your image. So I tend to move the sliders, and then I'll often come back and kind of play around with them a little bit and pull back from wherever I was. Split color warmth, I love when you drag the warmth slider to the right, it takes the warm colors and makes them warmer, or it neutralizes them if you go left. But I like to go a little bit to the right on a photo like this. I do want to bring up some of those warm tones. It's a nice color contrast with the bluer tones, like in some of the clouds and the icebergs. Talked about that earlier, playing those two, the complementary colors, the warm and the cool, off of each other. I try to do that in a lot of my edits if possible. The cool is, if I go left, the cool stuff gets cooler. If I go right, it kind of dissipates or gets neutralized. I'm going to go slightly negative there. And then color balance, I might do a little bit of magenta into the highlights, maybe a tiny bit of red, something like that. I feel like I've got a kind of a cotton candy creation going on here, which I kind of like, but it's very pink and kind of cotton candy like. But whether you like it or not, you can quickly and easily impact your colors using color harmony because it has a lot of power and color control. So there's before and after. And again, I see the spots. I won't be taking any spots out in any of these photos, but if you ever wanted to, you just click on erase and click on remove dust spots, and 99.9% of the time, it gets 100% of them. There's every now and then it might miss a little one, but it's really a good tool. Also, this is slightly crooked, it looks like. So you've got a crop tool where you can just come in and, just like any crop tool, straighten your photo, hit enter, and then it will apply that crop or straightening. You can do either or both. And boom, I've now got, I think, a straight photo. It's hard for me to tell sometimes. I feel like I need to see a chiropractor, but point is, it's quick and easy to go in and edit and get some really nice looking color without having to do a whole lot of, let's say, gyrations. I want to show you the ice cave one. This is that photo. Now, this is the blended HDR. So this is a TIFF file. I took 3 raw files. I blended them into a single HDR, which is a TIFF, and this is it right here. So this is my base photo after the 3 exposures have been merged. And I'm waiting for Luminar to get me into develop so I can do a little bit of editing here. And there we go. Now, what I want to do is I'm still going to start at develop. I tend to do that all the time. I want to lift some of these shadows because I want better visibility into that stuff kind of around me. You can kind of see how that's brightening that up quite a bit. Might add back a tiny bit of contrast, maybe pull back a little bit of highlights, maybe a little bit of vibrance. I don't know about warmth. I don't want to go to the right for sure because it's making the blue look kind of green. I might even lean into the blue a little bit, and I might add a tiny bit of tint. But then I'd still go to super contrast. And this one, let me show you what super contrast will do. Look at the sky. You see how much control you get over the contrast and the highlights. And so even though the photo started like that, I can pull that back and get a little bit better look in the sky behind him, which I think helps with my overall look of blending these exposures together. So I actually might go a little bit brighter with the midtone balance, and then shadows, contrast. You can go deep and dark and moody like that if you wanted to, or not. I think I'm going to just leave it shooting straight down the middle. And, I think that's made a nice little impact on the photo. You can see before and after, a little bit more evenly lit, which is often the goal with HDR, but super contrast and what I did in develop, I think, have both helped. I'm going to use structure AI next on this one. And this is all about just adding, it's like adding a little bit of crunch. I'm going to go to about a 30, 35, something like that. And you will notice 2 things happen. Number 1, there is more crunch in the photo, but number 2, it also gets a little bit brighter. So if you look at the before and the after, that little extra crunch, I think it works on a photo like this to apply it across all of that photo because there's so much ice and it's so thick and so textured, and it feels heavy that I think adding some extra crunch to it accentuates that look overall, and I like how that looks. So that's before and after. And then on this one, I might just go into toning, which would be called split toning in many other apps. I'd go into highlights, and I'm going to just drag the saturation a little bit to the right and leave the hue red. All that's doing is applying some of that reddish hue to the highlights, which is primarily going to be the sky, but also some of the light that's reflected across some of these parts of the inside of the ice cave. So before, quite a bit bluer, and after, quite a bit warmer. And this also, another example of me going back to what I talked about before, which is playing cool and warm off of each other. This is entire frame of really cool, meaning blue, kind of cold looking and feeling. And so I'm trying to play up a little bit of the warmth back here to give a little bit of a counterpoint to all the blue and the coolness. And so before and after, before and after, pretty significant change, just 4 filters, and it only took a couple of minutes. So that's the beauty of, I think, of Luminar's quick, powerful, and easy. And also, by the way, you'll see masking, and I'll get into masking in a couple of these other edits, but you can go in and apply these adjustments to certain parts of the photo if you want to mask. I haven't masked yet, but I will get into that here in just a moment. Let me get a quick sip of my tea. Okay, now I'm going to go over here and I'm going to get into this photo. And this is that waterfall that I showed at the beginning. And this is just a single exposure shot with the 14 mil prime. And I'm going to go into develop raw. And, you know, in looking at it, I need to brighten the photo a little bit. And I need to maybe a tiny bit of contrast, maybe put on the highlights, lift the shadows a bit. You can see that really opens it up. I'll hit the J key, and I don't really, you know, I've got some blown out over there actually. So let's pull that back. You can pull that back like that. Maybe I'll drop the exposure a little bit to keep that under control. I think that looks fine. I'm gonna hit that J key again to turn that off. I'm gonna lift the shadows a little bit more, and I might do a tiny bit of warmth here and a tiny bit of tint. I do the tint simply because I like it, and maybe a little bit of vibrance. So I've got that was my starting point, and that is my current point. Now I need to move something here. There we go. Got a little zoom window up in front of me, and I couldn't see a part of the photo that I want to see. Next is super contrast. Like I said, majority of the time I will use super contrast second, simply because the way I approach editing is thinking about light and then detail and then color, and light kind of continues as a common thread through the entire editing process, if you will. But I think of light first, but I think of light always. And so that's why I do develop raw with my raw file, primarily playing with the light, a little bit of color work like vibrance or temperature and tint, but not really much color work there. Then after develop raw, I go into super contrast and I start playing with these different settings just to see what looks best and how I think I want this photo to look when I'm kind of finished with it. So I think something maybe about like that. You can see how the sky, I've got much better control over the sky now. I just think it looks much better and richer. So before and after, I think that looks good. And the other thing I like to do is come in with a tool in the landscape category called golden hour, and you'll just see what happens. As the name implies, it's really great at sunsets and golden hours because it adds quite a nice pop of warmth to stuff that's kind of already got some warmth in it. And so I'm at like 29 here, but it's giving a nice dose of warmth really across the photo. So before and after, and it just creates a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more lively feeling photo. And again, that's because it's a warm tone. So that warm tones, they're a bit more energetic and powerful versus the cool tones, which are calmer. And so again, we've got another example here. We've got a lot of warmth up in the sky. These clouds are picking up that sunset light. And of course, that sun come in. It's also hitting the waterfall. We got a little bit of warm tones in the waterfall, but then you got all this blue in the sky. So it's a nice kind of counter to each other in terms of how these colors are showing up in the image. Now, one thing I want to do here is the greens aren't exactly what I want to have. So I like to go into HSL, and then I'll start with the hue of the greens. And I could go left, make them a little bit more yellow, but instead I want to go to the right and make them a little bit more green so that they're a little bit more lush and kind of rich looking. The only challenge with that is there's too much saturation in them. So I'm going to pull that down. So still in greens, but I changed the saturation. I don't want to go too low like that and make it really flat. And of course, I don't want to make it neon. I just want to pull that down a little bit just to tame those colors, because green's kind of bright. And if it's kind of saturated and bright, it will draw the viewer's eye. Just because it will. People are attracted to bright and colorful things. And so I don't want people to spend too much time looking at all the moss. It's cool to look at it, and it's a nice kind of frame around the waterfall and the pool there. I just don't want people to be overly distracted by it. So in that sense, I'm also going to drop the exposure or the luminance of that. So I basically made it a little greener, but I made it less saturated and darker. So in other words, I try to remove the potential distraction of that color. in the framing of that image. So there it is before, and there it is now. And then I might pop into toning, also known as split toning. I just like to do that with my sunsets, maybe give a little bit of warmth over there in the highlights. And that's going to hit all these highlight areas in the sky, but it's also picking up some of that in this waterfall. And once again, I see spots. I'm just not going to take them out, but they are there, and it's easy to fix. So, that might be an edit here. It just depends. I will often re-edit a photo and, come back 2 or 3 times and edit it differently. And in fact, my original edit of this photo, I took out these people, I took out that light that was shining this direction, and I took out most of the people over here on the path simply because they're a little bit distracting to me. I'm just not going to do all the erasing here, but you know how that works, I'm sure. So before, pretty dark. You can tell it was a colorful, beautiful sunset, but it wasn't that vibrant, and it was just way too dark inside the cave. And yes, I actually was shooting brackets here because this is another, just like that ice cave, this is a perfect example of where shooting brackets is going to help you, because it's going to help you capture more dynamic range by having multiple exposures. But for this session, I just wanted to do a single exposure. This was the middle exposure. But you can see, I mean, when you're shooting raw files, and especially with these Sony cameras, I mean, the dynamic range is so great that I've got a lot of leeway to take my base photo, which looks way too dark, and turn it into something that looks, I think, kind of awesome. So that's one of the main reasons I like Sony so much, is I just think the files give me so much to work with, and the dynamic range is just incredible. Okay, the only other thing I might do here is there's a tool called Mystical, and I like to add this sometimes. It's kind of a I'm going to use the term romantic lighting kind of tool, but you come over here and you can kind of see what it does. It creates some like soft, kind of shadowy, kind of smooths out the photo a little bit. And there is a lot of texture here, not just in the grass, but also in the inside underneath of this cave. There's just a lot of texture. So this Mystical kind of comes in, it darkens it, adds a little bit of contrast, adds a little bit of smoothing, but it really complements a landscape shot at the edges of the day and fading light. I use Mystical quite a bit because I just think it works so well on this kind of photo. So let me show you before and after. Before and after. So that's that photo. Now let me see. We've still got a few minutes. Derek, are there any questions I need to answer before I jump into another edit?
Jim, we do, if you have a moment to.
Of course.
All right. Elizabeth asking, what is the J key?
Oh, okay. Like, what does it do?
Yes.
Okay. So let me find a good photo for this. We can probably use this one. Let me reset this photo, and so you can just reset a photo, revert to original, and I will go in and let me show you what a J key does for you. It's there we go. Reset, develop raw. Let's just increase this exposure, and let's just increase the highlights and the whites. I'm gonna hit the J key, and there we go. You see this red overlay? When you hit the J key, it activates up in the upper left-hand corner, both the left and the right-hand corners of the histogram. It turns these little dots on. You can also just turn them off individually, but I just like to hit the J key, which will turn them both on, hit it again, turn them both off. But what it does, this is a visual cue that anything in red means it's completely blown out. There's no data in that area. It's completely blown. And so that's a cue, a visual cue that says, hey, Jim, you need to go fix the highlights here. Well, I messed them up on purpose. So what you can do is you can start pulling your highlights down. And as you drop the highlight slider, I get down to -100. I've got a tiny bit left. Well, I also brighten the exposure. So when I start dropping the exposure back to where I normally captured it, or actually did capture it, you can see that all that is gone. So it's a visual cue that indicates things are blown out. That's what red does. The opposite is true. So if I drop it like that, I can put highlights back to normal. And if I drop shadows, the opposite is in blue, which means this is completely black. There's nothing visible there. And so that's a way to tell you that, hey, you've got nothing that's visible in any area covered in blue. So that's what the J key does. It's a visual cue while editing to let you know that something's wrong, for lack of a better term. Not really wrong, but you've either got blown out highlights that'll be overlaid with red, or completely crushed shadows and blacks, which is going to be overlaid with this blue. So that's what that does, Elizabeth. It's just a great visual cue while editing to help you keep track of what your photo is doing from a highlights, or shadows perspective. You can usually tell anyway by looking at the histogram. If it's running way off to the left, you've got basically things that are completely black. And if it's running off way to the right, you've got some blown highlights. But it's a good visual cue. I like to turn it on, especially when I'm in Develop Raw and Super Contrast. And then I'll often later in my edit turn it on again just to check to make sure some of my subsequent edits haven't thrown off what I did with the highlights and shadows earlier on in my edit. So hopefully that answers the question.
Perfect. And one more quick question from Elizabeth. Would you remove the red jacket in the waterfall picture?
In the waterfall picture over here, red jacket. I assume that would be these people. Yes. In my final edit, I took all these people out. There were photographers. There were probably 40 people here. I don't know, maybe 30, maybe 50, but there were a fair amount of people. This section over here, I felt like was where I'm standing. Of course, I'm biased because this is the photo I like best. I also went over there. I didn't like the view and the lineup and where the sun was in relation to the waterfall. I didn't like it as much. So there were more people starting at about right here and then coming all the way around to way over here. So I was able to get those out of the frame. I couldn't get rid of these people, but yes, I would use the eraser. And for my final edit, I did. I erased all these people and got them out of my photo because I wanted to give that sense of serenity as though I had it to myself, as we often do when we're editing landscape photos. So yeah, good question.
Awesome. That's all we got for now, Jim.
Okay, let's do a couple of more photos here. This is called the Valley of Tears, at least colloquially, I can't say that word, but people refer to it as the Valley of Tears in Iceland. I posted this online, and then some people said that's not the name of the place. It's not even called that. I don't know. People we were with, including people that live in Iceland and have for 20 years, said, hey, this is the Valley of Tears. So I call it the Valley of Tears, but it also has a real name that's Icelandic and is about this long, and I can't pronounce it, so or remember it for that matter. The bottom line is it's really gorgeous and incredible. Like a lot of Iceland, you have these waterfalls just coming out of these hills and falling into this valley here. And so it's just, well, it's fantastic, to be honest. And so I think really, really pretty, like a lot of Iceland. And it's a great way or a great place to be shooting landscapes. I'm kind of playing around here with Develop Raw and just kind of experimenting with what I'm going to do with this exposure. But I think for this one, this is a good example of changing perspective. I shot many shots in this location in the typical horizontal mode. And I kept playing around with it and moving around. And I was like, this place is gorgeous, but all off to the left-hand side, from here all the way, it just went back up into a hill. And it was barren. It was just like this, looks like lava rock. It didn't make for a nice photo. And so this is where changing that perspective and flipping my camera over into the portrait orientation has paid off. It is way, way better looking photo than I had otherwise. And so I try to experiment when in the field because I sometimes walk away with photos that end up a lot better than what I initially was kind of thinking I was going to do. So I'm kind of playing with all the tools that I normally play with here, but excuse me, they are helping me kind of dial in this contrast. So I think that looks pretty good so far. And here's what I want to get into some masking. There's a lot of masking tools in Luminar, and of course, we won't get into all of them today. I'm going to go back into Develop because you can reuse tools again and again and again. And Develop, it has all these amazing different sliders in it. I use Develop. Sometimes I only use Develop on a photo because I can do anything I want with the light or the color with a mask by just doing this time and time and time again. And so I've got a massive amount of control. And so I'll often come back and use this tool repeatedly. In this case, I'm going to use a linear gradient mask, and I just want to drop this into the sky. And I like to create kind of a broad transitional zone, what I call the gradient zone, which is between this top line and this bottom line. And that's where the effect, which I haven't applied yet, but I'm just building the mask right now. but the effect, the edit, is going to be 100% up here where it's fully red. And as you can see, the color red fades away, and my edit, whatever I do, is also going to fade proportionally in those areas. In other words, it's going to transition from 100% of my edit to less than 100% of my edit and kind of smoothly dissipate into the photo, which basically means you get a smooth adjustment area, not an abrupt one. And the reason why that's important is I'm going to be dropping the exposure, and I don't want it to be a really hard line that says, oh, looks like Jim added a linear gradient but didn't fade the effect. So you're basically feathering so you get a smoother transition. All I wanted to do is kind of darken the sky. As the sky is a source of light, it's, pretty much 100% of the time going to be brighter than the rest of the photo. But I don't care, one bit about the sky in this photo. I'm glad I had clouds. It looks better than if it was just a blue sky, but I don't care about the photo. I don't want you to spend any time looking at it. So I'm trying to make it darker, and that's where a linear gradient helped. I'm going to go ahead and close that. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to get a tool called Accent AI. It's right here. It's a really powerful tool. It's kind of a, for lack of a better term, like a one slider to rule them all. It does a whole lot of stuff to a photo, and that's obviously way overdone. I wouldn't do that, but you can see what it's doing. It's popping the light and the color and the contrast and the saturation, all kinds of things. I tend to not use it at a very high amount, except in some circumstances. And most of the time, I'll control it with a mask. And so in this case, I'm going to get a radial gradient, and I'm going to reshape this. I'm going to invert it. And what I want to do is I just want to pop all the stuff that's going on here in the center of this photo, because that's what I care about. And that's what I care for the viewer to spend their time looking at, is this center of the photo and kind of that area there. So I think something about like that. I recommend playing around and adjusting, getting your mask the way you want it to be. But now that I've contained what I'm about to do to that area, I'm going to come in and you can see what's happening. I'm just getting a bit more intensity in that area, but I'm at 52, which is kind of high, but you can see what it's doing. It's brightening and creating a little bit more contrast, a little bit more saturation and color pop there. And so I will often use Accent AI with often a radial mask, actually, just to control so that it doesn't look over the top across the entire photo, because it can easily overwhelm a photo if you're not careful. So I think that looks pretty nice just doing that. And then I'm going to try a little bit of golden hour across the landscape. This is just going to take those warm tones that already exist, give them a little bit more warmth. I don't want to go too far and get super saturated, but maybe 20, 25, something like that. Looks pretty good. And that's just applying across the entire photo. So before and after, before and after, I think that looks pretty nice. And then I think I'll just wrap it with a vignette. And one of the best settings in the vignette is this inner light. And so all that does, as you can see here, is it'll default to the center of the photo. But if you want, you can click choose subject, and you can move the center of the vignette anywhere you want it to be. It actually works in the center of the photo in this one. But if you wanted to, you can change the center, and then inner light will emanate from wherever you choose the center to be. So I'm going to give it just a little bit. So it's, again, a slight brightening, maybe like a 15, just a little bit, and maybe just a little bit of darkening around the edges, just to kind of focus your attention. And, I don't want my vignette to be too over the top, so it might be a little heavy-handed. I recommend just playing around a little bit. But let me show you the before and the after. So fairly flat photo overall, and now quite a bit more pop in the image. So that is that photo. So do we have time for one more edit?
Of course we do, Jim. No, go for it.
Okay, cool. I thought I would do this photo because it's my actual. I'm going to do a shorter version of my edit in today's webinar, but my actual one, I had about 25 filters. I was doing all kinds of masking, but it's just it's a fun photo to play with, and it's a great photo to kind of experiment with masking, because you can do a lot of stuff, and you can really impact a photo by doing a lot of masking. So I'm just kind of running, for lack of a better term, through the first couple of tools here, because I'm just kind of getting things to look the way I want them to look for my my setting of the stage. I guess is kind of what I think of the first couple of tools as being. So before and after, before and after. I cooled it off a little bit. I changed the light around, but now what I want to do is start showing you how I like to use masking. And like I said, this gets into a bit of an advanced workflow, but I'll just kind of keep it simple and straightforward. I'm going to go into masking, get a brush, and right bracket key is bigger, left bracket key is smaller. I'm going to go with a little bit smaller brush here, and I'm just painting it in over this water. And all I'm going to do is come in and lift that exposure. So you can see and add a little bit of whites. So I'm just popping that water so that it looks a little bit brighter, more visible. So there it is before and after. I recommend that you don't hurry. And unfortunately, I'm hurrying, but take your time with the masks and be careful. But I wanted to kind of, these are going to be quick, is really what I'm getting to. So I recommend taking your time when masking. But I close that. I'm going to go get another mask. This is a linear gradient. And I'm going to do to the sky here, same thing I did to the sky in that last one, which is just kind of darken it a little bit. And all I'm doing is kind of shaping the light by being targeted and specific with all of my edits. So I'm just kind of coming in and doing things like this. I might even cool it off a little bit. I don't know if I want, yeah, I kind of, maybe a little bit like that. Maybe lift the whites a tiny bit. Something about like that, just kind of playing with the sky, bringing that down a little bit. Okay, I think I'm not going to do the temperature change so much. And I might take a little bit of saturation out of it. Something about like that. But I'm going to close that. And now I'm going to go into develop again. And this time I'm going to get another brush mask. And here I'm going to take a strength a little bit lower, so about a 50. Get my mouse to kind of come over here, and all I'm doing is I'm just kind of painting over some of these rocks, and you'll find out why here in a second. But essentially, this is going to be what people like to call dodge and burn. I'm just coming in and selectively targeting parts of the image and just trying to create a little bit darker look to them. So I'm going to pull that exposure slider down. So it's going to be applying just to where I applied that mask. So let's see, looks like Luminar hasn't caught up to me yet. Sometimes on live streams, when I do these webinars, I don't know if it's bandwidth or what, but hasn't caught up yet. Yeah, it hasn't caught up with me. But all I'm doing is creating some darkness. Let's see, yeah, it's hanging up. So the point is, this is like a dodge and burn kind of move where I'm just essentially creating a little bit more darkness on some of these rocks. There you go. That's too much, of course. I'm going to lift that a little bit, but I might drop the exposure, maybe add a little bit of contrast, and all that's doing, darkening that rock. And there it is before, and there it is now, just a little darker, which creates a little bit more contrast. Also, it makes that waterfall, which I brightened a minute ago, stand out a little bit more. Now that I've done that, I'm going to get some structure. I'm going to get a linear gradient, and I want to add a little bit of structure going across the photo, about like this. I feel like I like adding structure to landscapes, but I think you just got to be careful. It does brighten the image, as I showed you earlier in that ice cave, and also a structure. I feel like you would expect to see a little bit more structure close in the foreground, and you would not notice the detail as much in the distance. That's why I didn't carry it all the way over there. And that's why I used a mask, because I think that's kind of like, you're not going to see significant detail on something that's a few hundred yards away, but you are going to see it in this, which is right under your feet. So a little structure AI before and a little structure AI after. Now, having done that, there's a really cool tool called Atmosphere AI, and I can come in and I can add fog or mist. And in this case, I'm going to add mist, and I'm going to drag this to the right and do something about like that. But I want to come in, oops, not with that. I want to come in with a masking brush, and I'm going to go about like that. And I'm going to do this kind of just kind of punching it in a couple of spots. I'm not really even masking like with the brush. I'm kind of like just dabbing, almost like you would with a paintbrush, where I'm just kind of hitting a few spots. I'm simply just kind of playing, bringing up some of that fog and mist in those areas, and just to add a little bit more atmosphere to it. And then you can adjust the depth as well if you would like to, or the lightness, so you can make it darker if you want to. Maybe add a little bit more, but I've got a lower strength brush, maybe something about like that, just kind of playing up some of that natural kind of foggy mist that's there. There it is before, and I think we're hung up again. So I think you could see that earlier, but it looks like we're kind of getting hung up here. So my apologies. Yeah, that's kind of sticking. My point was, you can use tools like Atmosphere AI to kind of enhance Atmosphere, or add it if there is none, but you can enhance Atmosphere that's already there. And that's something I like to do, is just go in with the brush, add a little bit more to kind of paint it in. And then I'm going to use Mystical, which we used in a previous photo. And I'm going to take a linear gradient, and I'm just going to add a little bit of Mystical here, something about like that, and drag this down. So that's another broad gradient zone. So this effect starts to fade. And I'm going to come over here and add a little bit of that into those that lower part of the photo. So before and after, you can see that. And then I'm just going to hit it with a vignette, and then we'll be done. So a little vignette and a little bit of inner light, but the inner light's going to go maybe down in this area, kind of maybe down in there a little bit. Let me see. I just want to, yeah, something about like that. And then drop this vignette a little bit. I would play around with it, but you can just customize your vignette to your heart's content. But it really significantly shifts the light when you have that darker edge and, of course, brighter center with inner light. Really shifts the light around, and you can see that mist really popping. And I do see spots, right? So those need to be removed as well. But we're not going to do that today because we're out of time. So if you look at the before and the after, the before and the after, pretty significant change overall. The only other thing I sometimes do at the end of an edit is go back into develop one more time and just add a little bit of contrast, maybe overall, maybe drop the shadows, maybe lift the highlights and whites a little bit, simply because I have a couple of brighter areas. And it's just a little bit of a finishing touch on the mood. Maybe not that much contrast, maybe just a little bit, like a 15 or so. The bottom line is you have a lot of control in Luminar, and you can do a lot of customization. So before and after, and that's how that one went. And we're at time, so my apologies. It's running a little bit long, but I do like to talk about photos, and I do like to edit photos. So other questions out there, Derek?
Nothing so far that I see, and I'll prompt you guys because I know a lot of times when we watch you edit, we get locked into it. So if anybody does have any questions, feel free to get them in now. Jim, what's the hardest part about processing an image for you? I always like to ask other photographers, because I feel like sometimes some images are easy. Some images you're like, am I there? Am I not there yet? Or do I even really like this image?
Yeah.
What's hard about it for you?
It does depend on the image, but an image like this one, the hardest part for me was trying to figure out when I was done. As I said, my original edit, I was so excited. We were there, and it had these beautiful conditions, and it's a stunningly gorgeous and interesting place. And I was so excited to edit the photos. And I hate to say it, but I was almost a little bit afraid to start editing. So I was like, I don't know, like, how I'm going to edit this photo, because I want to play up the mood. I want to play up the light. And then I started editing, and I did like, 4 or 5 things. And I was like, cool. And then I sat on it, and I was like, I think I'm going to do a little bit more. And then I did like 3 or 4 more things, and I sat on it. Honestly, it took me weeks to decide on my final edit, which isn't really this. It's similar to this, but I did a bit more masking. I did a few more custom things with develop and that sort. And obviously, I took out the spots. But yeah, it's just knowing when to be done, because I love to edit photos, and I often will go back and re-edit a photo. Even if I just adore my edit, I might go back 6 months or 5 years later and re-edit, just new skills, new approach, fresh eyes, whatever it might be, and just decide I'm going to do something different. So I feel like I'm never done, honestly. Even when I'm done and I publish and I say, look at my photo, I'm so proud of it, I secretly might be thinking, oh, you know what I could have done? You know what would be cool is if I did this. Or so it's like I said, it depends on the image, but often it's just on an image like this that I consider fairly dramatic. It's trying to figure out when to be done, because I want to play up the drama, but I want to keep it real, and I want to make it interesting and beautiful and all those kind of things. And, so.
That all resonated so deeply with me. It's
Oh,
like
yeah.
you
Yeah.
think you're there and then you're not. And then
Yeah.
there's times where I edit late at night because everyone else is sleeping. The world is
Yeah.
asleep. And I feel like more at ease to just open
Yeah.
up my creative part of my brain. And
Yeah.
then I wake up the next morning. I'm like, no, I should have just gone to bed. What was I thinking last night?
Yeah. Yeah. I like color a lot. And people ask me sometimes, like, how do you avoid over editing? And of course, my first answer is many times I don't. I don't avoid it. I actually do over edit. But the way I try to fix that is I feel like, especially with color, we get desensitized to it after a while, because you're looking at it. And at first you're like, whoa, that's colorful. But after a while, you're like, it's not that colorful. It's like, that visual sugar rush is kind of wearing off after you just stare at it. So take a break, like go walk the dog or go to sleep, come back tomorrow or next week or next month. You know what I mean? Just take a break sometimes, because I definitely think we get desensitized to the stuff that we've done, which is another reason why I think it's hard to figure out when am I done with an edit, because I take those breaks on a one that I'm thinking and trying to put a whole lot of work and effort into, like I did when I initially edited this one. And I'm like, oof, man, I need to take a break, come back. And so sometimes it takes me longer than it's different than it used to be. Let me put it there. I used to just run them through and edit them kind of quick. And I didn't always have a plan or spend a lot of time thinking about it. I just kind of edited, just the way I edited, and went to town on it, but I didn't put enough thinking into it. And, in the last couple of years, I try to spend more time thinking about it, because, if you don't have a plan, you never know if you're going to get there. So, yeah. Anyway,
That's true.
Yeah.
Good. Always good to hear someone else's opinion on that. And we all struggle from time to time with, are we doing it, not the right way, but is there another way to do it? Or are other photographers going through the same things? The questions we constantly have in our head as we battle a constant imposter syndrome. So it's good to get everybody's opinion, everybody's view out there into the ether. And the more information you have, it's easier to take it back to your own process and apply. So Jim, we got 2 in the books, 1 more to go. Street photography Monday, right?
Yeah, Monday is going to be all about the street. So I'm looking forward to that one as well. It's funny how, like, I love to shoot cityscapes and landscapes, but also street. It's like 3 kind of, cityscapes and street kind of are similar in some regard, but it's a totally different idea when I'm going out to shoot. But I just three things I just like to shoot. And it's really just because, going back to the theme of this webinar series, it's because of travel. I used to always, for a previous day job, I'd travel to different cities, sometimes in different parts of the world, and I'd bring a camera. And so I started shooting cityscapes and street. And then if I was nearby and could easily get to a stunning landscape, I'd run out there and shoot it. So I was always interested in shooting, and who doesn't like landscapes, right? So anyway, so just kind of the things that I got into, but I'm definitely not a portrait photographer. That is the case. I'm not one of those. So that's a special skill.
One day we'll see if we can open up that skill set later on.
Ooh, yeah, it makes me nervous. I could, I go to some events. Like a friend of mine has some events here in Austin where models show up and photographers, and then, we take photos of them for free that they can use in their portfolio, and we get to practice, and he brings lights, and I go to those sometimes. It's kind of fun, but it's fun for me because it's social, talking to photographers and kind of practicing a skill that I'm not particularly great at, admittedly. It's just not really my thing. But I find that the better I get at that, the better and the more at ease I am when I'm out on the street doing street photography. Like when we were in New York back in June or July, whenever it was, and we're walking up to people and talking and saying, "Hey, can I take your photo? Would you stand?" That practice portrait practice is helping me get better at taking some kind of a, not pose. Well, I guess they were posed in some cases. We were
you were natural. You were natural.
I don't know about that, but I like talking to people. It's fun, and if they're willing to have their photo taken, I'll do that. But it's not. I would never do portrait work for hire, like senior portraits or wedding portraits or things like that. I don't think I could do that. So anyway,
look, we all have our genres we stay away from, and I know I have mine, and everybody, I like to stay in my lane. So
Yeah,
Well,
I'm
Jim,
with you on that.
always great to have you on. A ton of great information,
Thank
images.
you.
We got one more in this series. So huge thank you to Sony again for sponsoring this series. But that's all we got for you all today. Thanks for tuning in. As always, we'll see you back here on Monday with some more virtual event space. Check you out next time.
Adios. Thanks, guys.